In the year 114 BC, a young woman named Aemilia stood in the Forum Romanum, wearing the recognizable white robes and the elaborate hairstyle of a Vestal Virgin. She had been serving the sacred fire of Rome for almost 15 years, and now she was about to face death. The pontiffs had already declared their judgment, guilty of incestum, the violation of her vow of chastity. The punishment was ancient, established by traditions that went back many centuries. She would be taken outside the city walls to a place where a small underground chamber had been prepared for her. There, she would be locked inside with a burning lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, some milk, and a small portion of oil. Then the entrance would be covered with earth, and she would be left to the gods. But what makes Aemilia's story more complex than it seems is that she was not a helpless woman taken from obscurity. She had once been one of the most powerful women in Rome. She had rights that no other Roman woman possessed, not even the wives of senators or the daughters of generals. She could own property without the supervision of a man. She could make her own will. She had the best seats at the theater and at the gladiatorial games. Condemned criminals could receive pardon just by accidentally crossing her path on the street. And now, that same woman was sentenced to be buried alive. If you are interested in the true and complicated reality of women's lives in the ancient world, how power and vulnerability could exist in the same person, how privilege came together with restrictions, and how religious authority created both danger and opportunity, then stay with me. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from. I truly want to know how far these stories reach, because what I am about to tell you will challenge much of what you think you know about ancient Rome, about religious power, and about what freedom really meant. The story of the Vestal Virgins is not a simple tale of oppression or empowerment. It is both, and at the same time it is neither. It is something far stranger and more revealing about the nature of human society than any comfortable story can show. Let me take you back to where it all began. To understand what happened to Aemilia, Licinia, Marcia, and all the women who wore the white robes and kept the eternal flame of Rome, you first need to understand what a Vestal Virgin truly was, and I assure you it is nothing like what you have heard. The beginnings of the Vestal cult reach back into the earliest history of Rome. According to tradition, King Numa Pompilius established the order in the 8th or 7th century BC, though the exact date has been lost over time. He created 6 priestesses, always 6, never more and never less, whose only duty was to guard the sacred fire of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. The flame could never be allowed to go out. For the Romans, this was not a myth or superstition, it was a fact of life. The eternal flame symbolized the life and spirit of Rome itself. If it were to go out, the city would fall. The survival of Rome depended on those 6 women who kept the fire burning year after year, generation after generation. But here is where things become even more interesting. To tend that sacred flame and to protect the very existence of Rome, not just anyone could be chosen. The requirements were extremely strict, and they tell us much about what the Romans believed regarding purity, power, and the female body. The first rule was age. The Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, would choose candidates between 6 and 10 years old. Not younger and not older. They had to be prepubescent, physically whole, representing the perfect condition before womanhood began. The second rule was family. In the beginning, only patrician families, the ancient Roman aristocracy, could present their daughters as candidates. Both parents had to be alive, married to each other, and living respectably. The girl could have no physical or mental defects. She had to be, in the eyes of Roman law, entirely perfect. The selection process was called captio, meaning taking or capture. 20 candidates were brought before the Pontifex Maximus. Out of them, he would choose one. The moment she was chosen, something remarkable took place. The girl was legally released from her father's authority, the patria potestas that ruled every other Roman woman's life. She did not pass from her father's control to that of a husband, as all other Roman women did. She became something unknown in Roman law, a woman who belonged to no man. Let me introduce Licinia, not the one executed in 114 BC, but another Licinia who lived during the 2nd century BC. We know of her from Cicero, who mentioned her many years later in one of his legal speeches. Licinia was selected at the age of 7, taken from her family home on the Palatine Hill, and brought to the house of the Vestals in the Forum. The ritual that transformed her was carefully organized. The Pontifex Maximus took her hand and pronounced the ancient formula. I take you, Amarta, to be a Vestal priestess, to perform the rites which it is lawful for a Vestal priestess to perform on behalf of the Roman people, under the same conditions as she who was a Vestal priestess on the best conditions, Amarta beloved. Every Vestal at the time of her initiation was given the name Amarta, no matter what her name had been before. This was the first act in shaping a new identity, one separated from her birth family and belonging only to the goddess Vesta. Her hair was styled in the Sani crines, 6 braids coiled around her head, a hairstyle otherwise worn only by brides on their wedding day. This was not accidental. A Vestal lived permanently in the transitional space other Roman women crossed quickly, the passage from daughter to wife. But the Vestal remained there, forever suspended between girlhood and womanhood, between one family and another, belonging to no one and yet to everyone at once. Now, here is what the romanticized versions of the story never mention. Licinia's family did not offer her out of devotion or honor. Suetonius writes that during the reign of Augustus, families used their influence to prevent their daughters from being chosen. Many parents tried desperately to avoid having their daughters selected. Augustus himself claimed he would have offered his own granddaughter, had she been of the proper age, attempting to shame the hesitant nobles into compliance. Why such resistance? Because once chosen, a girl was gone. Not dead, but gone. She would live for 30 years in the house of the Vestals, 10 years learning, 10 years serving, 10 years teaching the new novices, 30 years of virginity, 30 years without marriage, without children, without the normal life path of a Roman woman. But in return for what she sacrificed, she gained something no other Roman woman could possess. Let me make this clear because it is essential for understanding everything. Vestals had powers, both legal and social, that were absolutely exceptional. A Vestal could own property in her own name and could make her will without any man's approval. These rights may seem minor until you realize that every other Roman woman, all of them regardless of family or fortune, needed a male guardian to carry out legal acts. A senator's wife could not sell or purchase property without consent from her husband, father, or brother. A Vestal, however, could freely buy and sell. Vestals possessed the right of sacrosanctitas, the same sacred protection held by the tribunes of the people. To harm a Vestal meant death. Their persons were untouchable. When a Vestal moved through the streets of Rome, she was preceded by a lictor, the same attendant who went before magistrates, clearing the way and commanding respect. If a Vestal happened upon a condemned criminal being taken to execution, the prisoner was immediately freed. The Vestal didn't need to act or speak. Her mere presence was enough to overturn a sentence of death. This was not a courtesy, nor a tradition. It was written law. Vestals received the best seats at all public events, gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, religious ceremonies. They sat in the front rows in places of honor visible to all. They were living symbols of Rome's sanctity and strength. And here is something you may not expect. Vestals could give testimony in court without swearing an oath. Every other witness had to swear they were speaking the truth except the Vestals. Their word was accepted as true without question. They were, by law, considered incapable of lying, and because of that, they were trusted to keep wills and important documents, including those of the emperors themselves. They had access to the secrets of the state and were witnesses to treaties. During the later Republic and the early Empire, they became political actors in their own right, using their neutral position to mediate between rival factions, to beg for mercy for the condemned, and to carry messages between enemies who trusted no one else. In 143 BC, a Vestal named Claudia did something never seen before. Her brother, or perhaps her father, the consul Appius Claudius Pulcher, had been refused a triumph by the Senate, yet he decided to hold one anyway. When a tribune tried to stop the triumphal chariot by force, Claudia threw herself in front of it, using her sacred protection to shield her brother. The tribune could not touch her without committing a crime punishable by death, and so the triumph went on. This was power, real, visible political power, held by a woman in a society that allowed women almost none. But why am I telling you this? because you have to understand what a Vestal truly was before you can understand what happened when one of them broke her vow. They were not powerless victims. They were among the most privileged people in Rome, and that makes what happened to them when they fell even more revealing of how Roman society truly worked. The vow was simple, absolute chastity for 30 years. No sexual contact of any kind was permitted, and the punishment for breaking that vow was death, but not a normal death. The Romans believed that shedding a Vestal's blood would defile the city, so they created a form of punishment that technically did not involve killing her. They buried her alive. The procedure was described in detail by Plutarch, who wrote centuries later but relied on older sources. When a Vestal was found guilty of incestum, the violation of her vow of chastity, she was dressed in burial clothes and placed on a covered litter, like a corpse being carried to its grave. The litter was carried through the forum in total silence. People moved aside as it passed, without speaking. The Vestal inside could not see anything. She could only hear the footsteps and the heavy, dreadful quiet around her. The procession went to a place near the Porta Collina, one of Rome's ancient gates. There, a small underground chamber had been prepared. Inside were placed a bed, a lamp filled with oil, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and some milk. Just enough, Plutarch said, to clear the Romans from the accusation of starving a sacred woman to death. The condemned Vestal was then led down into the chamber, and the entrance was sealed. Earth was heaped over the spot until no sign remained of what lay below, and then everyone departed. The Romans could claim they had not killed her. They had merely placed her underground with provisions. What happened afterward was between her and the gods. If she was innocent, the gods would save her. If she was guilty, the gods would judge her. This was the fate that awaited Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia in 114 BC. But this is where the story becomes more complex, more political, and more revealing about what was truly happening in Rome at that time. The trial of these three Vestals was not really about sex. It was about power, crisis, and scapegoating within a republic that was beginning to tear itself apart. The year 114 BC was a time of deep fear and anxiety in Rome. The wars with the Germanic tribes were going badly. Rumors spread of defeats, of Roman legions being wiped out. The social war was already approaching on the horizon. Rome's Italian allies were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with the way they were treated. Political factions were in constant conflict with each other. The old foundations of the republic were beginning to fall apart. And then a strange omen occurred. A young woman, the daughter of a knight, was struck by lightning and killed. In Roman belief, lightning did not strike by chance. It was a message from Jupiter, a clear sign of divine anger. Something in Rome's relationship with the gods was no longer right. Something had to be corrected. The haruspices, the priests who interpreted signs and omens, consulted their sacred books and announced their conclusion. The Vestals must be investigated. Now pay close attention to what happened next because it shows exactly how these trials were carried out. 3 Vestals, Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused of violating their vows of chastity. The accusation came from a slave. Think about that. In Roman society, a slave normally could not testify against a free citizen. But in cases involving the Vestals, the ordinary rules were set aside. The impurity they were believed to have caused was considered so dangerous that any kind of testimony could be accepted. The case was brought before the Pontifical College, the council of priests responsible for judging religious crimes. They conducted their inquiry and reached a decision. Aemilia was found guilty. Licinia and Marcia were declared innocent. Aemilia was sentenced to be buried alive, and the sentence was carried out. But the Roman people were not satisfied. The crisis was not over. The gods, it seemed, were still furious. Everyone could see it. Clearly, the Pontifical College had made a mistake. 2 guilty Vestals were still alive, still defiling the city. Public outrage forced the Senate to intervene. A special court was established under the authority of Lucius Cassius Longinus to reopen the case. This was unprecedented. The jurisdiction of the Pontifical College over the Vestals had always been absolute. But political necessity overpowered religious law. The special court reached a different decision. All 3 Vestals were found guilty. Licinia and Marcia were sentenced to be buried alive. Their supposed lovers, whose names have survived, Lucius Veturius, Marcus, and Manius Aemilius, were beaten to death in the Forum. And here is what you must understand. There is no solid evidence that any of these women or men were truly guilty. No witnesses saw them together. No one testified to any specific act. The accusations were based mainly on the fact that young men had visited the house of the Vestals, and that the Vestals had been seen speaking with men at public religious festivals. In other words, they were condemned for being friendly with men, for being young women who spoke with young men as part of normal Roman life. But Rome needed someone to blame. The gods needed to be appeased. The people needed to believe that something was being done to resolve the crisis. And so, 3 women who had devoted their lives to serving Rome, who possessed extraordinary power and privilege, were put to death for crimes they most likely did not commit. This was the dark heart of the Vestal system. The same privilege that gave them influence also made them ideal sacrifices when things went wrong. They were separated from normal society, existing in a liminal, uncertain state. Neither men nor women, neither children nor mothers, neither citizens with families nor slaves without rights. When Rome needed someone to blame, someone whose death would carry meaning, the Vestals were available, and it happened repeatedly throughout Roman history. In 216 BC, during the darkest period of the Second Punic War after the defeat at Cannae, 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were found guilty of unchastity. One took her own life, the other was buried alive. In 73 BC, a Vestal named Fabia was accused of incestum. She was acquitted, but only after a painful trial that damaged her name. The doubt was never fully erased. In 90 AD, Emperor Domitian became obsessed with restoring traditional Roman morals. He directed his attention toward the Vestals. Cornelia, the Virgo Maxima, the chief of the Vestals, was charged with breaking her vow. She was buried alive without even receiving a trial. 3 other Vestals were also convicted, and Domitian allowed them to choose the manner of their own deaths instead of facing burial. Notice the pattern. These trials appeared during times of military defeat, political upheaval, and the transition from republic to empire. Whenever Rome felt endangered, whenever the old order seemed to collapse, Vestals were prosecuted. The historian Holt Parker has argued that Vestals acted as pharmakoi, ritual scapegoats. Their deaths were intended to cleanse Rome and restore the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Their guilt or innocence was almost beside the point. What mattered was that they were sacred, set apart, and thus effective sacrifices. But remember the privileges they possessed, the legal status, the political importance, the wealth, the honor. All of that made them even more suitable as scapegoats. The higher they stood, the greater their fall meant. When an ordinary woman died, it carried little meaning. But when a Vestal died, a woman set apart as holy, possessing authority beyond ordinary women, her death held weight. It became a true offering, a loss of something valuable. The system produced women with extraordinary privilege specifically so that privilege could be taken away when Rome needed a public act of punishment. Now let us look at the women who survived, because not all Vestals were executed. Most completed their 30 years of service and retired, and what followed reveals another layer of this story. After 30 years, a Vestal was released. She could leave the house of the Vestals. She could marry. She could finally live the life that other Roman women had experienced long before. But very few chose to do so. Historical records tell of some who married, usually in their late 30s or early 40s, past the usual marriage age for Roman women. Most never married. They lived on the wealth they had gathered. Remember, they could own property and had no male guardians to claim it. Independent women in a society that had no category for independent women. Some stayed in or near the house of the Vestals, maintaining informal connections to the order. Others became patrons, using their resources to support younger Vestals or to finance public works. Inscriptions dedicated to them record their generosity and praise their service. Yet within these inscriptions lies an unease, the discomfort of a society uncertain how to define women who no longer fit any ordinary role. They were honored, but the praise sounds hesitant. They were wealthy, yet their wealth did not fit comfortably into a system based on male inheritance. They were free, But freedom at 40 after 30 years of limitation was not the same as freedom at 20. There was a Vestal named Unia Torquata whose story is especially poignant. She served from about 30 AD to 60 AD, through the reigns of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. She witnessed Caligula's madness and Nero's cruelty. She tended the sacred flame while the world around her fell into disorder. She completed her duty. She was free. Afterwards, inscriptions appear that honor her, set up by relatives, nephews and great-nephews she had hardly known, men thankful for the distinction she had brought to the family, yet regarding her as a curiosity, a relic, a woman beyond ordinary categories. She never married. She lived about 20 more years after her retirement and was buried with honor. Her tomb marked clearly as that of a former Vestal. Even in death, that remained her defining identity. Not daughter, not sister, not wife, not mother, but Vestal, forever shaped by those 30 years. Let me now describe the daily reality of life as a Vestal, because it is essential to understanding what this institution truly was. The House of the Vestals stood in the Roman Forum, at the very center of Rome's religious and civic world. It was a large compound containing living rooms, work areas, open courtyards, and the Temple of Vesta itself, a small circular shrine that housed the sacred flame. The Vestals lived communally. 6 women, from young girls to those near 40, sharing the same space, working together under strict rules that governed every detail of their existence. They rose before dawn. The sacred fire had to be kept burning without pause. Each Vestal took turns watching it, ensuring the flame never went out. If it did, even by accident, the Pontifex Maximus would have the negligent priestess whipped. If it happened repeatedly, if it looked like carelessness instead of chance, harsher penalties could follow. They also prepared the mola salsa, the sacred salted meal sprinkled on sacrificial victims. This was their exclusive responsibility. No one else could make it. Every public and private sacrifice in Rome required mola salsa produced by the Vestals. Through that substance, they were symbolically present at every act of worship across the Roman world. Think about that power and burden. Each time a farmer sacrificed a pig for his harvest, each time a general sacrificed before a campaign, each time a family honored its household gods, the Vestals were there, represented through the mola salsa. The survival of Rome's entire religious system rested on 6 women performing this one duty correctly. They also safeguarded the sacred objects, whose precise nature remains mysterious even in ancient accounts. One of them was the Palladium, supposedly brought from Troy by Aeneas. It was said that Rome's safety depended on it. If it were lost or stolen, the city would fall. The Vestals protected it. Only they could enter the inner sanctum where it was kept. Only they knew its true appearance. Ancient descriptions differ widely, showing that no one outside the Vestals ever saw it clearly. They performed rituals throughout the year, the Vestalia in June, when the inner chamber was opened briefly so matrons could offer sacrifices. The Forticidia and Perilia in April, fertility festivals where a pregnant cow was slain and the ashes of unborn calves distributed for purification. The Lupercalia in February, where they prepared the sacred cakes. These duties were not optional. They sustained Rome's very survival. To miss them or perform them wrongly meant the anger of the gods upon the city. Yet ancient writers rarely mention what filled the rest of their lives, the ordinary days between solemn ceremonies. There were thousands of hours simply living. 6 women sharing close quarters, bound by regulations but still human, facing small irritations, forming real friendships, navigating the shifting hierarchies of communal life. We glimpse them only in scattered references. A letter from Pliny notes that Vestals attended literary readings. Inscriptions record gifts they exchanged. Hints appear of rivalries within the order. Stern senior priestesses and others more kind, younger Vestals restless under constraint and others content with their lot. They were not living in serene contemplation. They lived inside an institution, with all the politics and personalities that entails. And over everything hung the awareness that a single false charge, one political storm, one unlucky lightning strike misread as an omen could lead to burial alive. Several ancient authors remark that some Vestals developed a distinct way of walking quick with short steps, eyes fixed ahead. It was the gate of women who knew they were always being watched, always judged, always one mistake away from catastrophe. Now I have to speak about the other side of this story, the one that complicates the idea of oppression even further. Some Vestals embraced their authority. Some used their rare position to influence Roman politics and society itself. In 63 BC, during Cicero's consulship, a Vestal named Fabia appeared at the trial of Publius Claudius Pulcher. Claudius had been accused of sacrilege. He had disguised himself as a woman to enter the rites of the good goddess, a ceremony from which all men were strictly excluded. The trial became a huge political scandal, and Fabia gave testimony. Her words carried such weight that both prosecution and defense built their cases partly around what she said. She had been present at the rites, she had seen the events, and her word held unquestioned authority. Claudius was ultimately acquitted, most likely through bribery, but Fabia's testimony continued to carry weight. For years afterward, orators referred to it as the definitive account of what had happened that night. A woman had shaped the official memory of a major political event, something almost unheard of in Roman society. Or think of the Vestals during the civil wars of the 1st century BC. When Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon and advanced on Rome, when Pompey escaped and the Vestals remained at their posts, both sides sought their support. Both wanted them to store critical documents, to mediate conflicts, to lend legitimacy to whatever power would prevail. The Vestals were the keepers of Caesar's will. After his assassination, they brought it forth and read it publicly, revealing that he had adopted Octavian as his son and heir. That single revelation determined Rome's future. Without the Vestals' custody and publication of Caesar's will, Octavian might never have become Augustus, might never have founded the empire. 6 women, staying neutral amid civil war, decided who would rule the Roman world. This was agency, real political agency, exercised by women who were supposed to have none. So what should we think of this system? Was it oppressive? Yes. Girls were taken as children, denied normal lives, forced into lifelong virginity under the threat of death, and sometimes offered as human sacrifices. Was it empowering? Yes, as well. The Vestals possessed legal and political rights unknown to other Roman women. They had genuine influence. They affected politics and preserved tradition. Some clearly found purpose and dignity in their service. The truth is that both things were real, and that duality should make us uneasy. We want simple stories, oppressor and oppressed, strong and weak. But the Vestal system resists such clarity. It built a space where women could wield power, but only by renouncing what Roman society viewed as womanhood, marriage, motherhood, sexuality, family. It honored them as sacred, but that sacredness made them expendable as sacrifices. It freed them from male authority, but only by binding them to religious duties so strict that one failure could bring death. And this, I believe, is the essential thing to grasp about the Vestals. The system functioned precisely because of those contradictions. Romans could point to the Vestals as proof that women were respected, that they could hold authority and influence, that Rome valued female virtue and ability. Yet the same structure ensured that female power stayed exceptional, marginal, dependent on separation from ordinary life. A Vestal had rights precisely because she was not considered a woman in the normal Roman sense. She was something in between, something that could be praised precisely because it stood apart. The power of the Vestals did not weaken Rome's patriarchy. It reinforced it. Rome could boast, "Look, women can hold great power, so long as they abandon marriage, family, sexuality, motherhood, so long as they remain virgins serving the state, so long as they may die if they disobey." That is why the story of the Vestals still matters, because we still see versions of this pattern. Exceptional women are given power only as long as they remain exceptions, so long as they do not threaten the systems that limit most women. They become tokens, proof that the system works, even as that system keeps the majority constrained. The Vestals were real people who lived real lives, and some of them found genuine fulfillment in what they did. I don't want to erase that, but they lived inside a structure that used them, that granted privilege precisely to preserve authority, that could destroy them when politically useful. In 394 AD, the Christian emperor Theodosius finally dissolved the Vestal order. The sacred flame was extinguished after more than 1,000 years. The house of the Vestals was closed. The last 6 Vestals, whose names are lost to history, were granted pensions and sent to live privately. Rome did not collapse. The eternal fire went out, and the city remained. The entire theological foundation for the Vestals' existence, that Rome survived only while the flame burned, was shown to be a myth. But for over a millennium, generations of women had shaped their lives around that belief, surrendering marriage, family, and sometimes their lives to sustain a fire that, in the end, could be extinguished without consequence. What are we to do with that understanding? How can we honor the women who served, while recognizing the system that exploited them? How can we acknowledge their agency without denying the constraints that surrounded them? I have no simple answer. But I know this: the Vestals deserve remembrance as they truly were, not as symbols of virtue or oppression, but as real women navigating a structure that gave them both power and peril in equal measure. Aemilia, buried alive in 114 BC for crimes she had not committed, became one of many whose stories remind us how fragile the boundary between honor and horror could be. Her death was meant to purify Rome, to calm the gods, to reassure the people that order still existed. Yet what it truly revealed was the cost of that illusion: the lives of women sacrificed to preserve the appearance of stability. For centuries, the fire of Vesta burned as the symbol of Rome's endurance. But the true flame that sustained the city was human: the devotion, fear, and obedience of women like Aemilia, Licinia, Marcia, and countless others whose names are forgotten. They carried the weight of Rome's fate in silence, and when the fire finally went out, the empire did not die with it. It was the women who had already been buried, forgotten, or erased who kept Rome alive for 1,000 years. And that is why their story still matters. Because every empire, every system of power, builds itself on human lives, and it always demands someone to keep the fire burning.